Welcome back to the Unfiltered Political Lens podcast. Today, we're going to discuss a part two of the very first episode I made of the Japanese internment camps here in America. We're going to discuss other nationalities that were involved in these internment camps as well. Welcome back to the Unfiltered Political Lens. I want to talk to you and part of American history that remains one of the least discussed and the least understood chapters of the 20th century. Story tied to war, fear, immigration, identity, and civil liberties, and what can happen inside a nation when national security begins to collide with personal freedom. When most people hear the words internment camps in America, they immediately think of Japanese American incarceration during World War II. That history is essential to remember, and it deserves the attention it received. There's another side of the story that many Americans never learn in school, rarely hear in documentaries, and often only discover through family stories or buried government records. And that is the story of Germans in America who were detained, monitored, arrested, and interned, and in some cases imprisoned during World War I and World War II. This history affected thousands of lives directly and many thousands more indirectly. Families were broken apart and communities were changed. Languages disappeared from public life. Businesses closed, property was lost, reputations were destroyed, and some people spent years behind barbed wire on American soil without ever being convicted of a crime. And for many descendants, these stories remain quiet for decades. Today I want to walk with you through actually the history from the beginning, not just what happened inside the camp, but what life looked like before that and what it changed during wartime, how fear spread through the country and how German Americans responded, what the government didn't want happened after the wars ended, and why this history still matters in America today. Now, to really understand what happened to Germans in America during the World Wars, we have to begin with how deeply German communities were already woven into American life long before the wars began. German immigration to America stretches back to the colonial period. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Germans were arriving in large numbers and settling across the United States. Many came seeking farmland, religious freedom, economic opportunity, or they escaped from political instability in Europe. They became farmers, blacksmiths, teachers, merchants, brewers, clergy, laborers, soldiers, craftsmen, and business owners. By the late 1800s and the early 1900s, German Americans were one of the largest ancestry groups in the country. Their influence was everywhere. German language newspapers circulated wildly. German churches held weekly services in German. German schools taught reading, writing, and literature. Music societies performed across cities. Breweries became economic anchors. Neighborhoods reflected German agriculture and culture. Families preserved receipts, traditions, and holidays passed down across generations. In many places across Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Missouri, and Texas, hearing German spoken in public was completely normal. The German identity was not hidden. It was visible, open, and deeply American. And then the war changed everything. When Europe entered World War I in 1914, the United States initially remained neutral. Americans watched the war from a distance while millions fought overseas. But that neutrality ended in 1917 when the United States entered the war against Germany. Once America declared war, public opinion changed fast. The German Empire became the enemy abroad, and in many cases, that hostility began spilling onto Germans living inside the United States. National propaganda encouraged loyalty and unity. Patriotism intensified. War bond campaigns spread. Flags flew everywhere, but fear also spread. And fear has a way of collapsing distinctions between the governments and ordinary people. For many Americans at the time, Germany, the enemy nation, became blurred with German neighbor down the street. That shift changed lives immediately. German nationals living in the United States were labeled enemy aliens under federal wartime law. Thousands were ordered to register with the government. They were photographed, fingerprinted, documented, and monitored. Some had mail intercepted. Some had telephones watched. Some had property investigated, some employment scrutinized, movement could be restricted, and travel could be limited. People could be detained based on suspicion of loyalty to the enemy or potential sabotage. More than 6,000 Germans were interned in the United States during World War I. Some were held in military camps such as Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, and others were detained elsewhere around the country. Many were merchant sailors caught in American ports when war was declared, and others were civilians. Some were intellectuals, some were workers, and some were detained by specific accusations. Others were swept up more broadly under wartime fear. And outside the camps, life changed for nearly every German American family, whether they was detained or not. German language newspapers rapidly disappeared, and public schools ended German instruction. Libraries removed German books. Churches shifted service into English. Organizations with German names rebranded, and families stopped speaking German in public. The children were encouraged not to use the language outside the home, and some people changed their surnames. Some hid their family origins, and some buried cultural traditions to avoid suspicion. Businesses with German branding removed their signs, and communities that had proudly embraced German identity became quieter. They were less visible and more cautious, sometimes afraid. There were cases of anti-German harassment and violence in the country, and people were pressured to publicly demonstrate patriotism. The loyalty became performative, and citizens felt they had to constantly prove they were American enough. And even after World War I ended, the social damage did not disappear. It lingered in the families, it lingered in silence, and it lingered in what was no longer spoken openly. Then just over 20 years later came World War II, and with it another wave of fear and government action. When the attack on Pearl Harbor happened in December 1941, the United States was thrust fully into global war again, and national fear surged overnight. Government emergency powers expanded rapidly. Military security became a dominant national priority, and once again, Americans connected to nations at war with the U.S. found themselves under scrutiny. The incarceration of Japanese Americans became the largest and most sweeping program, but the Germans and Italians were also targeted under wartime restrictions and internment. More than 11,000 Germans were interned during World War II by the United States government, and far more than that were monitored or affected by restrictions. The people detained came from different backgrounds. Some were recent immigrants, and some were longtime residents. Some were legal, permanent residents, and some had lived in America for decades. Some were anti-Nazi refugees who had fled Hitler's regime, and some had spouses and children who were American citizens. Some had never imagined they would be treated as threats. Yet wartime classification placed them under suspicion, and the FBI conducted arrests soon after America entered the war. Some arrests were based on prior investigations, and others were precautionary. Community leaders, clergy, educators, businessmen, and others could be detained if considered potentially dangerous under wartime authority. But the story becomes even broader when we look beyond the continental United States. The United States government also worked with Latin American countries to deport Germans from overseas into American internment camps. German nationals living in Peru and elsewhere in Latin America were rounded up and sent to the United States. Some were forcibly removed from their communities. Some had businesses confiscated. Some were separated from home permanently, and there were some who later exchanged in prisoner negotiations between the government. Many had little ability to challenge what was happening, and one of the most significant camps in this history was Crystal City, Texas. Crystal City became a family internment center. Entire German families were held there. Men, women, children, grandparents, infants. Families tried to live normal lives inside confinement. Children attended school and families cooked meals. People gardened, people formed routines, and people celebrated birthdays and holidays. Parents tried to protect their children emotionally from what was happening around them. But all of it existed behind fences, under surveillance, with guards watching and freedom removed, and life continued, but under confinement. That reality shaped entire childhoods, and some children later spoke about it, remembering barbed wire as part of daily life. Others remembered confusion and wondering why they were there, why they could not leave, and why their family had become prisoners. Many internees were never charged with violent crime. Many were detained under emergency wartime policy rather than criminal conviction. Some remained in prison for years. Some were repatriated and some were exchanged abroad. Some returned after release to communities changed forever. Many lost their homes. Many lost their jobs, and many lost businesses and their savings. Many lost trust, and perhaps hardest to measure, many lost the sense of belonging. And what continues to stand out to me most is not only that this happened, but how little is remembered today. For many German American families, silence followed the war. Some wanted to forget painful memories, and some feared stigma. Some focused on rebuilding their lives, and some assimilated more fully into broader American culture and stopped passing stories down. German language use declined sharply, and the traditions faded. Families' history became fragmented, documents were boxed away, and photos disappeared in drawers. Stories went untold, and because of that, this chapter slowly faded from broader American memory. But it remains important because this story is bigger than Germans alone. It forces us to ask difficult questions about democracy during crises. What happens when our governments operate under fear? How do emergency powers affect ordinary people? What happens when nationality becomes linked? How easily can civil liberties be narrowed during war? How quickly can communities change? And how does fear reshape identity? And how do later generations decide what parts of history to preserve or forget? For me, remembering this history isn't about assigning blame to people living today. It's about understanding history honestly and completely. It's about looking directly at a moment where American ideals were tested, moments where freedom and fear collided, moments where policy touched ordinary lives in painful ways, and where stories nearly disappeared because too few people kept telling them. The history of German internment in America deserves to be remembered alongside the broader history of wartime detention in the United States, because it happened here on American soil. Real families, real communities, real people whose descendants still live among us today. Their story is American history, and it deserves to be part of the conversation. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Unfiltered Political Lens. If this history was new to you, or if your own family has stories connected to German American life during the world wars, I'd be interested to hear about it in the comments below. Sometimes the most important pieces of history are the ones that nearly disappeared, and bringing those stories back into the conversation matters. If you found this video informative, please like, share, and subscribe. It really helps support the channel, and it helps keep these deeper historical conversations going. Thanks again for being here. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. And as always, peace.